Could people please start taking their seats? Oh. I'm gonna fall. Okay, I'm gonna see if I fall. All right. I got a nice little step back here. If I topple down, it'll be a great start to the day. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. It's great to see so many of you here in the room today, and I know we have a large number of people watching the webcast. I'm Kathy O'Regan, Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research, or PD&R, here at HUD, and we're one of the sponsors of today's event. And I want to start by thanking our co-sponsors, Habitat for Humanity and Enterprise Community Partners. This collaboration is the perfect foundation for the conversation we're going to have today and for any follow-on work in this area, because it's going to take just that, collaboration, across groups, silos, and geography to tackle this issue. And in that collaboration, it might be helpful for people to understand a bit more about PD&R. So this is the plug place for my talking about PD&R a bit. PD&R's mission is to inform policy development and implementation to improve life in American communities. We do this by conducting, supporting, and sharing research, surveys, demonstrations, program evaluations, and best practices. In essence, through knowledge building and knowledge dissemination. PD&R plays a critical role in HUD's evidence-based policymaking by assessing what works and what doesn't, by collecting data so we can answer questions with objective evidence, and by disseminating best practices to inform the policy community more broadly. So let me provide a concrete example, one that connects directly to today's topic, the housing affordability opportunity, lowering costs and expanding supply. PD&R's largest data collection effort is the American Housing Survey, a nationally representative panel data set on housing units and their occupants, the only source of such data for our nation. It's used extensively by researchers and policymakers, and I predict you're going to hear many statistics today that are based on those data. And it also forms the basis for our congressionally mandated report on worst-case housing needs. Our most recent worst-case report found that in 2013, more than 7.7 million households of very low-income renters without government assistance either paid more than half of their income in rent, lived in severely substandard housing, or both. While that number has improved modestly since its peak 2 years earlier, it remains 9% greater than in 2009 and almost 50% greater than in 2003, 50%. Those numbers document a continued housing affordability crisis, one that's felt broadly throughout the nation, but also is most acute for those with least resources. There are only 39 affordable units available for every 100 extremely low-income renters. Those are households with incomes below 30% of area median income. The shortages and resulting high costs documented in this report and elsewhere can have profound effects on our society. Housing is often the largest expense for families, so the increased cost of housing is basically equivalent to lower real earnings in terms of how far a family's income can go. And there's evidence that the high cost of housing may also be a drag on our economy and contribute to increased inequality. Both issues are getting more and more national attention. The crisis identified in our worst case needs report needs addressing far beyond HUD's programs. So that's what we're here for today. To do that, we're gathering experts and evidence together to inform policy, to assemble the broader set of knowledge and players needed to tackle the housing affordability issue. And with that, I'm pleased to turn the microphone over to PD&R's lead on and mastermind behind today's event, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development, Lynn Ross. Lynn will share more details on the event, how the day is organized, and she's going to introduce the first panel. Thank you.
Good morning. Come on, we can do better than that. We're excited. Good morning. But more like it. So thank you, Kathy, for that great introduction. Although I have to say, I have not been called a mastermind since I was a kid and my brother accused me of cheating on Monopoly, which I was not doing. We've all been there. In all seriousness, I wanted to extend a very warm welcome to all of you today. This event is many months in the planning, and I know I speak on behalf of PD&R as well as our co-sponsors, Habitat for Humanity and Enterprise, when I say that we are thrilled to see this day come to fruition, and we've got a fantastic program planned for you. As Kathy noted, if you know PD&R, you know that we love evidence. Well, we also love seeing that evidence transformed into effective policymaking and decision-making. So that's how we've organized today's program. Our first panel, which we'll hear from in just a few moments, will explore the evidence underpinning housing affordability. So what do we know about the drivers of cost, and how are those drivers impacting our access to affordable housing? This panel is going to look at this issue from the neighborhood and metro level here in the US, but also take a global perspective, because we know that housing affordability issues aren't just happening here in the States, they're in fact a worldwide issue of concern. Following this panel, we'll have a visit from our very own Secretary Castro and Vice President Biden. I know we're all very excited to hear from them. They are both well-known champions of expanding opportunity across this nation. And then we'll close today's program with a panel that's focused on solutions. So that's that translation piece I was talking about, moving from evidence into policy and practice. So that final panel will look at how this evidence, how this data is informing some of the most promising practices in place. I think you're going to hear some really interesting real-world examples from a really diverse and excellent panel. So I hope that you'll stay with us through the end of the program. Now I just have a few program notes to pass along before we dig into the meat of the conversation. But as I do that, I'm going to invite our first panel to come up on the stage and get comfortable and be seated, so come on up. Okay, our first program note is that we are live tweeting this event right now, so you can follow our updates on @PDR-events. We'll be tagging all of our updates with Housing Opportunity, and we invite you to share your feedback using Twitter as well. Just please tag with Housing Opportunity. Our second program note is that we want this discussion to be just that, a discussion, as interactive as possible. So for those of you who are joining us in the room, you'll notice a mic here in the center aisle. Moderators will be inviting you to step to the mic to share your feedback and your questions at the appropriate time. And for those of you who are joining us via webcast, you are not left out of the Q&A process. We invite you to tweet your questions to PDR events and tag it with Housing Opportunity. We'll actually be reading some of those questions out during the Q&A so that your questions can be answered as well. And a final program note is you are about to learn about some amazing research, starting with this panel and throughout the day, from the likes of Enterprise, the Urban Land Institute, McKinsey, the Moelis Center, and many others. You should know that that research is available to you on the event website, which is at huduser.org/housingaffordability. We also have a number of the reports that you're going to hear about available on our resource table, which is right outside the room. So you'll have a chance to visit that table a little bit later during one of our breaks, but I know that you're going to want to take home a lot of this great information and use it to inform your own work. So again, I want to thank you for joining us today. I have to say, this set of issues is one that is near and dear to my heart. I too am a researcher and have done work in this space, so I am particularly excited about today's conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to the very capable hands of Stephen Seidel. Stephen is the Senior Director of Global Program Design and Implementation at Habitat for Humanity International, and most importantly right now, he is the moderator of our first panel, Understanding the Evidence. Stephen.
Lynn, thank you so much, and really appreciate the warm welcome and the great support that HUD and the whole team, Kathy and Lynn and everybody here has provided to make this event and make this day possible. The theme for this symposium, Addressing Housing Affordability, is a challenge that affects 1.6 billion people around the world. It's increasingly important that we address this challenge now. Housing costs are on the rise, while wages and access to housing finance for lower income families remains constrained in the aftermath of the Great Recession. Over on Capitol Hill, Congress is currently considering funding for multiple HUD programs that affect housing affordability, such as Section 8, Home, CDBG, and the SHOP program, a unique program that leverages more than $6 in private investment for every SHOP dollar allocated. More than 1,400 Habitat for Humanity affiliates in the U.S. and and Habitat programs in over 70 countries around the world work to address the issue of housing affordability every day. The scale of the challenge is why Habitat's new strategic plan directs the organization to look beyond construction, to promote policies and systems that advance access to adequate affordable housing. And it is why later this year, Habitat will launch a global campaign to improve access to land and secure tenure around the world. That timing coincides with increased attention on global housing issues. In September, world leaders will approve the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. Advocates around the world, including Habitat, are working hard to make sure housing affordability is included in those goals. And in October of next year, HUD will be leading the U.S. delegation to the U.S.-sponsored Habitat 3 conference in South America, a gathering that takes place once every 20 years. It's kind of the Halley's Comet of housing conferences. It is possible to effectively address the affordability challenge for lower-income families, whether through quality rental housing or, as Secretary Castro has stated and supported, through effective homeownership programs, which can help lower-income families build financial assets through pursuing the homeownership option. The second panel today, as Lynn mentioned, will examine some of those solutions. But first, this panel will drill down into the details of the housing affordability challenge. In the interest of time, I'll introduce our outstanding presenters only briefly as they begin their remarks, but I do encourage you to visit the website for this event, which contains the more complete biographies of each of our presenters, and you'll be as impressed as I am by their backgrounds. Each presenter will share their prepared remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers with all of you, including those of you watching the webcast that's been arranged for this event today. So let's get started. Our first presenter is Mike Spotts from Enterprise Community Partners. The centerpiece of Mike's remarks will be a report that Enterprise and Urban Land Institute recently released titled Bending the Cost Curve. Michael?
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm very excited for the opportunity to participate in this great panel. At the risk of contributing to statistical overload, I can't resist citing a few more statistics about the housing affordability challenge in the United States. According to Enterprise's estimates using HUD and Census Bureau data, there are 19 million households in the United States today that are housing insecure. And by that, we mean that they are either homeless or spending more than 50% of their income on housing, also known as being severely cost-burdened. This latter group we estimate to be potentially one missed paycheck away from losing their housing situation. And this applies not just to people that are struggling to find work in a tough economy or those that are on a fixed income because they're elderly or disabled. According to the Center for Housing Policy's latest housing landscape report, 25% of working renter households and 17.1% of working homeowners are also severely cost-burdened. And over the last 15 years, the absolute number of households in this situation has continued to increase. At the same time, resources for affordable housing have been diminishing. The HOME program is at its lowest funding level in its program history, and there are 67,000 fewer Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher households as a result of the sequestration cuts. So what are the dynamics that are leading to this situation? Wage growth or the lack thereof is certainly a part of it, but it's also the result of a lack of supply to keep up with the demand for housing, particularly in hot economic markets, the ones that are driving job creation in the country. And just to illustrate a couple of high economic growth markets, when you add up the number of building permits issued in the year to date in San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, you don't get to the total number of building permits issued in just the Houston market. Now, there are differences in market, political context, geography, etc., and there's some externalities with the Houston development climate that we wouldn't necessarily want to replicate, but I think that goes to show that when you look at the relative affordability of Houston to the California markets, that supply and demand do play a role. So it's within this context that Enterprise joined with the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center for Housing on the Bending the Cost Curve research initiative. And our goal was to talk to as many people and as many markets as possible to figure out ways that we can promote cost-effective, affordable housing development while still maintaining quality, and that is both in the developments that we build and in the locations in which we build, so that there is opportunity for low and moderate income households. And what we found was that there is no single silver bullet. There's no single innovation that we can all dedicate our time and efforts towards that will fundamentally change the cost dynamic. Rather, we kept hearing anecdotally, well, this only adds 2 or 3 or 5% to costs. Well, those 2 and 3 and 5% cost drivers add up. And it creates a challenge because we're going to have to address multiple levers at once. But it's also an opportunity because we can also experiment and innovate in many different ways. So I'm just going to close by touching on a couple of the broad themes that our recommendations from the report can be collapsed underneath. And one is addressing the supply and demand dynamic. We need to look at our regulatory context, our zoning codes, our density limits, our building codes, and figure out ways that we can unlock supply and reduce the cost of what does get built and make the market stretch further. And that will also benefit the creation of dedicated affordable homes through subsidy programs as well, because we'll be able to do it more cost effectively. We also, within that context, we need to look at finance and figure out ways that we can fund innovative projects, both through the private market and through subsidized programs. You can't build what you can't finance. So if you have an innovative idea that could address a niche, such as accessory dwelling units or micro units, you need to have the capital to pilot and scale those innovations. And then we also, the second theme is to take a look at the dedicated affordable housing programs and figure out the ways that we can stretch subsidy dollars as far as we can to meet the growing need. And one way to do that is to adopt innovations that we highlight in the report that consolidate, coordinate, and streamline a very fragmented system. And then finally, especially in the context of competitive funding programs, we need to improve and align our incentives so that we are creating incentives for cost control while at the same time avoiding a race to the bottom in terms of quality and opportunity. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation and hearing the rest of the panel speak as well.
Mike, thank you so much. And I would highly recommend reading the report that Enterprise and ULI put together, Bending the Cost Curve. It's a terrific report and provides great food for thought. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Jonathan Wetzel. Jonathan led a team recently from McKinsey Global Institute to produce a report titled The Blueprint for Addressing the Global Affordable Housing Challenge. And as we were preparing for our time here today, Jonathan and I were discussing how to lead off, and I do have a question for you, Jonathan. With respect to housing affordability, how does the U.S. stand compared to other countries? So you can tackle that now or in the context of your broader remarks. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stephen. And I've got that. We titled our report A Blueprint for the Affordable Housing Challenge. I think I like today's seminar title better. It's the Housing Affordability Opportunity, because it really is one. And we addressed this issue primarily because when we started to step back and say, what are some of the bigger sort of public-private challenges that the world faces, we came right smack into this. I mean, the house, as we know, is not a house. A house is a relationship. It's a relationship to employment, a relationship to family, to education, to community. It affects us all, and the city is life, and without this kind of a solution, we impoverish ourselves in so many ways. We thought, this has to be something we tackle. And if we tackle it, then it creates all this opportunity. So I'm not going to repeat all of the numbers, just say we're roughly in the same ballpark. We think it's about 1.5 billion people globally that are affected by this, by the housing affordability challenge, 450 million households by 2025. And as it befits the United States, we're of course a world leader. The United States, depending on how we measure it, absolutely right. So it's somewhere between 19 and 34 million households that are affected by housing shortages, housing unaffordability. Looking at anywhere between 1% and 2% of the GDP in terms of the gap between income and actual cost. For a house that is anywhere between 100 square meters to 212 square meters being the average size of a US. So if you take the 212 square meter number, you take the 30% of income, and you look at the 80% of AMI, you come up with roughly 34 million households, or a gap in total of about $300 billion to close between what is the income available versus the actual cost of that housing. And so that gap is that $300 billion gap compares to China as the second biggest at $180 billion. So, we are clearly a world leader. Now, this is something that is not potentially the right place to be. We need to close this gap. We need to find solutions which would translate roughly into a 30% reduction in supply costs. If we can reduce supply costs by 30%, we can close this gap, and we can make that investment economic. That investment, in turn, is then an opportunity. That is, in fact, a $10 trillion opportunity globally. If we can globally reduce the cost of housing by 30%, this now becomes $10 trillion of investment opportunity. That's a very big number. So if they're thinking about this, instead of it as being a burden, something that we all have to somehow expend money on, rather as if we can just be smarter about this, if we can think of new ways, if we can employ market mechanisms and our talents and our technology to close this gap, this can become an opportunity. So that was the idea behind our report, is to say, what are the ways of just being smarter? What would we do to draw on the best practices globally and in our local context, apply them? And I have to say, so the essential point of our report is saying, are there such opportunities? And we find of course, that there are. And I'll just give a very brief, and they're not going to be too much surprise to the experts in the room, but you start with land, and we have tremendous opportunities to unlock land. It's always seemed to be a tremendous contradiction that on the one hand we have homelessness, and on the other hand we have unused land. So it's clearly something is not transacting in the land market. And as we know, the land market is notably intransparent. So how does one make the land market reflect demand and supply better? And so by unlocking land, whether it is through transit-oriented development, through it is inclusionary zoning, through better policies around land value and relationship to tax, so capturing the value of the unused land, we think you can easily reduce the cost, not easily, but you can reduce the cost of land by up to 30% on a per square meter basis. And this will be the single biggest opportunity. But it's not the only one. Construction, the industry globally has not improved its productivity over decades. It stands unique among industries globally as being an industry which has not improved productivity compared to people who make toothpaste or semiconductors. I mean, why should this be the case? Why should the construction industry, why do we build buildings today much like we built them 30 or 40 years ago? So by employing more industrialized programs, whether it's prefab or better design and standardized procurement, again, another 20 or 30% cost reduction, productivity improvement possible. And finally, we have operations and maintenance, sort of a lot easier to do maintenance on 10 buildings than on one building. And so by grouping together procurement coalitions, there's an opportunity there. And finance. Many times finance for the consumer, but also finance for the developer. Typical low-income housing development, $20 million project. You find somebody spending 3 years to assemble 20 different loans to do this project. It takes them as long to put the financing together as it does to build the building. So creating financing opportunities for low-income developers creates obviously value for the consumer. It also creates access. So those four things together create the opportunity to reduce the costs in total 30%, create a $10 trillion investment opportunity.
Those are real dollars, Jonathan, 30% here, 30% there. You can get to 10 trillion pretty quickly. So, I would also recommend the Blueprint report from McKinsey Global Institute. It's a terrific, very thorough, well thought, brilliantly reasoned package, and so I really would encourage you to review that. Jonathan, thank you so much. We'll now turn to our third presenter, Max Wesselcouch. Max is from the Moelis Institute for Affordable Housing Policy at New York University's Furman Center. And Max will walk us through the additional challenges that families and communities face when affordable housing is in short supply. Max?
Great, thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to be here, and you'll have to forgive me. I'm trained as a statistician, so I'm going to add a few more numbers to this conversation. And I want to take us from this national and global perspective to actually talk about some cities and neighborhoods. And the first point I want to make is that this housing affordability challenge is not just affecting the superstar cities that make headlines like New York and San Francisco, but in fact, the Furman Center has a forthcoming report where we study the 11 largest cities in the United States and find across the board that rent levels are increasing at rates faster than inflation and much faster than income. Low-income households are especially hard hit. We find that 3 out of every 5 low-income households in these large cities are paying more than 50% of their income on rent, and that rate has increased in recent years. When we look at populations with slightly higher incomes, so more like what an entry-level teacher or police officer would be making, we also find that these renters have become increasingly more rent burdened. Since 2006, the share of moderate income renters facing severe rent burdens has increased substantially in LA, in Miami, in Philadelphia, and right here in Washington, DC. And there are really only 2 ways that a household can become less rent burdened, either by making a higher income or by moving to a lower rent unit. It's pretty well established that incomes in the United States have been stagnant for at least the last 15 years. And in this report, we also try to look at the supply of housing units that are affordable to moderate income households and find that stock has been shrinking since 2006. In these large cities, the median renter could afford fewer than 1/3 of the recently available units on the market. And of course, the situation is much more dire for low-income households. And then the second point that I want to make is that affordable housing is important, but housing isn't in a bubble. Housing units are located in neighborhoods. So when developing an affordable housing strategy, we must also think about the neighborhood characteristics. One of the most important is transportation, and that includes the cost of transportation, whether that's car ownership or public transit, the accessibility and reliability of public transit, and then the connectivity of neighborhoods, so what amenities are available within walking or short traveling distances. To that end, the Center for Neighborhood Technology has a really excellent housing plus transportation affordability index where they take into account the costs of both direct housing costs and also transit. And besides transportation, there are other neighborhood characteristics that are really important. High quality public schools can increase children's educational achievement. The presence of employed neighbors can provide essential social networks to connect residents with job opportunities. And there's a growing body of research that shows neighborhood safety is critical, and that exposure to violent crime at a young age can impede children's cognitive development. But the challenge is that the best mix of these neighborhood amenities, so where you have access to transit, high quality public schools, low crime rates, these also tend to be the most expensive neighborhoods. And these high housing costs make it difficult to develop affordable housing in those neighborhoods. The Furman Center put out a report recently that's out on the table outside, where we look at the location of affordable housing in New York City and how that relates to neighborhood characteristics. And we find that subsidized affordable housing tends to be located in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates, higher violent crime rates, lower performing public schools. And we also look at the change over time. Over the last decade, we've seen that as owners of affordable units in high opportunity neighborhoods have the chance to convert those to market rate or luxury developments, they do so. And most of the new development is happening in lower opportunity neighborhoods. So over the last decade, we've seen a real concentration of affordable units in lower opportunity neighborhoods. But of course, when thinking about policy development, there are always trade-offs. To develop an affordable unit in a higher cost neighborhood would likely require more government subsidy. So governments are faced with this trade-off where they could either develop more affordable units in lower opportunity neighborhoods or fewer units in higher opportunity neighborhoods. I don't have an answer for that yet, but I hope that will at least spur some discussion today. So, thank you.
Great. Max, thank you so much, giving us a sense of kind of broader than just the housing unit itself, the context, the setting in which the housing is located. I should mention, just to add a little bit of evidence to the discussion, my son who lives in Denver called over the weekend. He said, my rent is going up 19%. And I said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, he said, I called the landlord and I asked him, why are you raising it 19%? And the landlord said, because we can. So, I mean, there is in certain markets, I mean, Denver, I don't know if that was one of the 11 that you studied, but certainly in lots of places, the pressure on rents is considerable. So thanks for your wonderful presentation, Max. And our final presenter, thanks to the excellent work of the air traffic controllers on the Eastern Seaboard, is Lisa Davis from the Ford Foundation. And Lisa will share with us her perspectives on the Housing Affordability Challenge with an emphasis on access to housing finance and the necessity also of bringing a rights-based approach to tackling this important problem. Lisa?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I walked in just in time, so I was very pleased about that. It's great to be here. Thanks very much. I feel like the odd person out on the panel. I'm not a statistician or academic, so most of what I'm going to share with you comes from the last 5 years in my experience in working with the Metropolitan Opportunity Program at the Ford Foundation in 10 metropolitan regions around the country, and then increasingly internationally. Stephen asked me to talk a little bit about predatory lending and the role that finance plays in affordability, as well as thinking about the rights-based framework. And for us at the Ford Foundation, the rights-based framework is very important. As a social justice foundation, we think a lot about not just what are the technical aspects that lead to housing and affordability, how do we bring down costs and things like this, but also about the political will to change the circumstances that create the inequality that's behind the housing affordability crisis overall. So I think we're all fairly familiar with the outcomes of the run-up in predatory lending in the United States. And predatory lending, I guess I would say, is when certain groups have to pay more for financing than others, and it leads to a place where they don't have access to good credit and where costs are escalating. We're in a place right now where the pendulum in the US has swung the other direction. And I don't know how many of you looked at the Urban Institute's report last week, where their studies indicated that in 2014, there was a mortgage gap of 1.25 million households in the US. So what that means is that if we were using 2001 credit standards, really before the run-up and a lot of the predatory lending started, there would be 1.25 million households that would be eligible for mortgages that were not able to get them in 2014. So if you take this over time, this means that an entire generation is being shut out of the homeownership market, and opportunities for a form of affordable housing in the US that generally requires less subsidy and becomes more affordable over time to the families that stay there. Most disturbing is that most of the decline in that credit access occurs not as a result of regulatory changes, in other words, things happening with mortgage finance reform or additional consumer protections, but they're lender overlays. So the decrease in lending for people between, I believe it's someone in the audience is probably from Urban Institute, they can get my numbers exactly right, but I think it's between a 640 and a 720 credit score, 76% decrease in loans in that segment. And that's probably most young people in the United States, most first-time home buyers. We also see that given kind of the demographic shifts in the United States, we're becoming a majority people of color country, that most of those loans are, most of those denials are in communities of color. and we are going to see a disparity in the access that this country has to home ownership. Globally, financing is particularly difficult for the unbanked, for people that don't have access to regular financial institutions. And the World Bank estimates that that's about 2.5 billion households, about half of the adult population in the world. There's been a lot of progress, and we've been involved in some of it around the globe in access to banking, mobile banking, and different types of technology. And I think that that's an increasing place for hope, and I think your report looked at a little bit of this as well, Jonathan. So one of the ways to address predatory lending and other types of housing exclusion is through this rights-based approach. And when I think about a rights-based approach to housing, I think kind of about three categories. First is the right to fair financing and consumer protections to ensure fair financing, the predatory lending conversation just before, the right to housing and to shelter, and then the right to housing choice. And this really gets to your point, Max, about the right to live in a place that has all of the good things that we all want for our families. So each of these points provides a legal framework that can support and encourage policy development that can compel local and national governments to create affordable housing policies and programs, and also provide an opportunity for redress when the public and private sectors fail to deliver on these rights. So, just a couple of examples, and I think in the next panel they're going to get a lot more into implementation, but, a right to fair financing example of a regulatory framework is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And we have seen very clearly, historically, that predatory lending decreases when there's actually regulatory enforcement, and that's an important tool. The problem that we have right now, of course, is that the pendulum has not swung the other way in terms of too much regulation, but that the regulation has become a way for lenders not to make the business decision to lend. So I think in cases where you have consumer financial protection regulations, which are very important, you have to pair that, dare I say, with the duty to serve, that you have to have a duty to serve all populations and all people in a financing system. The right to housing, some examples that we have of that internationally are quite strong. I think probably the strongest one is the constitutional right to housing in South Africa. And that has been a tremendous tool for people, particularly in informal housing situations, to create affordable housing. The issue, of course, is that just because there is the right doesn't yet mean that there's the delivery system to make it happen. But I think that's changing over time. One of the best examples that we've seen of that is in Brazil. And the My House, My Life program in Brazil, by US standards, I think has created an amazing amount of housing in a short time. It really was motivated by some of the Brazilian right to housing movements. I think my statistics may be a little bit old, but I think they've created something like 2.5 million units of housing since the program started in 2009. Created 1.4 million jobs in the process. Again, the issue is that there are actually thousands of units of that housing that's sitting empty because it was built in places that were not accessible to transportation and opportunity that people needed in order to maintain their livelihoods and pay the rent, although affordable, on those homes. I think we also are seeing a lot of unintended consequences of the right to shelter in New York City, where we started the de Blasio administration with 53,000 people in homelessness, and now are up to 60,000 living in the shelter systems, and without an outlet on the other side of that to create permanent affordable housing. It's a pretty difficult situation. And then finally, the right to housing choice, someplace that I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years, really manifests itself in the U.S. as fair housing and in civil rights. And in the U.S., I think there's two ways, right, that we address the right to choice and the right to housing. One is to prevent housing discrimination. That's largely plays out as individual discrimination through testing and enforcement, very important function. But it also plays out in the concept of disparate impact. In other words, we're required to look at the overall unintended consequences of discrimination, of housing policies, of housing finance, and find that in many cases, as you mentioned, Max, affordable housing has been concentrated in specific areas without great access to opportunity. That doctrine is in danger, as you probably know. There's a Supreme Court case that we predict will be decided in the next 6 weeks that could have a very positive or very negative effect on the ability to continue to use that tool.
Lisa, thank you, and thanks to all the panelists. I mean, in barely half an hour, we've kind of had a global, national, local community scan of kind of the housing conditions that we're facing and the extent of the affordability challenge. So thanks for your great preparation and great comments. We want to turn it over now into a dialogue, and we want to invite the folks viewing via webcast and also those of you here in the auditorium to prepare your questions and come to submit them. We have a microphone here in the middle aisle, so we'd invite folks to prepare and queue up behind the microphone, and we'll field as many questions as time allows. So encourage you to do that. As we get started and as you get cogitating on all your wonderful questions, I want to throw a question out to the entire panel and have you consider, given all the information that was just shared, would you characterize the affordability challenge as more of a failure in the marketplace or more of a failure in public policy? And wonder if any of you might have some initial thoughts about that.
My first thought was that it's almost impossible to separate the two because policy sets the rules under which the market works. Mm-hmm. So, and I think you need to address both factors. If you look at the policy framework of a given housing market, if you have density restrictions that make rental housing infeasible, then you're going to have a market failure in terms of the rental market. You're not going to be able to have enough homes to accommodate the families that need them. So if you look at your density restrictions, if you look in the single family context, setback requirements, building size requirements, parking requirements, all those factors contribute to what we would think of as the market failing to reach the full range of incomes that it is capable of reaching. But at the same time, the housing affordability, it's been mentioned a couple of times, it's a function of both housing costs but also wages. And if wages aren't increasing, we can definitely lower the gap between productivity and construction costs and lower those figures, but there's only so far down that you can get it. Concrete will eventually cost what concrete costs, and we're not in the ballpark where the market can reach the people of the lowest incomes, whether they're people on fixed incomes or low-wage workers. So to some extent, particularly in high-cost markets, if we want to say that people have a right to live where they have opportunity for jobs, for transit access, for good schools, the market is having a hard time reaching those households, so there needs to be public policy that can strengthen the affordable housing networks in those communities.
I'd second that. I mean, I also agree it's very hard to separate, and I probably wouldn't take sort of make it a who's failing here as much as how do we work together to create the opportunity and relentless optimist. There just doesn't seem to be any point to be anything else because, I mean, why? Because there is so much opportunity here, whether it is on the private sector side and being more efficient and more productive, or in the public sector and thinking through what's the common good, what's the shared good here, and what's the shared value that we create by all of this. This city is a productivity engine, and cities that are more effective at integrating all segments of their societies grow faster. They increase their tax basis, they create more jobs, they create more consumption, and everybody gets richer. And so the inability to kind of see the growth opportunity is at root a lot of the problem here, that communities simply aren't working together. And that is where we can make a difference, is by showing the opportunity to everybody, saying this is something that does require a conversation. It requires a conversation between the people who are the community, the landholders, hopefully those are the same people who are governing them, and have that conversation about how we're going to best use this very scarce resource. It was Milton Friedman, who's the only tax that Milton Friedman liked was land tax. Because when you tax land, you don't get any less of it. You only got so much. So how are we best going to use this land? This is all of our land. It creates as much value as we collectively want it to create.
All right.
I guess I would add a third. I guess I would add a third point to this, which is I agree that it's both of them. But what you're pointing to, Jonathan, is really that we have to have the collective will to make it different, to make housing and stable housing and affordable housing a priority. And part of the problem that we have as housers, and I'm guessing that most people in the room have some connection to affordable housing, is that we tend to talk about it in a way that's not broadly, massively appealing, and doesn't create a whole lot of social movement energy to change the way that things are. And so fundamentally, I think we as housers need to learn to talk about what we do and what the outcomes that we're looking for differently than just units of affordable housing. It really is about access to opportunity. We know now, we have evidence that it's about health, it's about educational outcomes, it's about how long you live and and where your children go to school. And these are values of equality that we know that most Americans share, and that people don't support the kind of inequality that they're seeing in their communities.
Thank you. I want to pick up on and pose a question to Max. And again, please do get ready with your comments and line right up at the microphone. But taking Jonathan's kind of big picture references to the $300 billion gap that's needed or resources that needed to fill the gap in the U.S. Given the kind of locally nuanced and specific context in which affordable housing happens, I mean, how would you think about that kind of lump sum of money if it were to be kind of rained down on you if you had all the power in the world to apply that in the local context that you guys have studied?
I think that's a great question, a really fun question to think about how I would fix New York City and all of these other high-cost cities with unlimited funds. But I don't know how realistic that is, so I think it's also important to think about what the market solutions are and how policy can help to really harness the market towards these solutions. And the Furman Center released a report 2 weeks ago called Creating Affordable Housing Out of Thin Air, which analyzes some inclusionary zoning policies. We created some mock pro formas for market rate inclusionary zoning developments in different neighborhoods in New York City. And from that report, we find that inclusionary zoning can actually be a really great way to reach some of the lowest income households. From a developer's perspective, requiring a number of units to be income restricted is quite costly, but if market rents are high enough, then they can balance that out and cross-subsidize those units. But it didn't really make a difference in the pro formas whether you were targeting a household at 80% of AMI or 60% or 30% of AMI. It was just having an affordable unit was what impacted the costs, but what income level that reaches had very little effect. So we think that could be an opportunity to reach some of the extremely low-income households.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that. I'd love to see that report.
Yeah, I think it's on the table.
All right.
So.
And there are, by the way, for folks in the room here, there is a resource table outside the main auditorium here with quite a number of materials. Habitat for Humanity has its 2015 shelter report, which focused in on energy efficiency and the important role that energy costs play in maintaining affordability for housing. So, Jonathan, any thoughts on that? I know you were kind of reacting to what some of the thoughts that Max was sharing about.
Well, I agree. I think that the inclusionary zoning idea is absolutely one that's very appropriate in a context where you've got zoning first of all. So Madeleine Albright said, what good is it if you don't use it? So how do we think about the highest value of it? And also, you know, that's a pile of money that's an opportunity again. It's from both supply and demand side. I think the one issue you're getting at is that if you just put all the money on the demand side, do nothing about supply, you accomplish a vast transfer of wealth to the landholders without actually solving the problem on the demand side. And so unlocking supply is absolutely expanding supply. That's got to be a focus for that. So that I'd put most of that $300 billion into unlocking supply.
Excellent. Great. Thank you.
It's also probably worth mentioning that there are a lot of low-cost cities that are also experiencing housing affordability crises, right? That have to do largely with the incomes of people living in those places, as well as availability of financing and the types and location of housing that exist, the housing stock that exists in the city. So places like Cleveland and Detroit, where the population has been moving further away from the city center and into the suburbs, while the regional wealth picture may not have changed, the wealth picture within the city has definitely changed, making that housing affordability equation really unworkable for a lot of people, even though there's a surplus of housing that we might, from New York City and Washington, D.C. standards, consider to be affordable.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Lisa. We do have a question. Please identify yourself and pose your question.
Good morning. My name is Jesse Leon. I am new to HUD's Choice Neighborhood team. Only been here about 4 weeks, and it's an honor to be here working with HUD. My background is philanthropy and private real estate development, in particular multifamily affordable housing. In addition to our internal philanthropy department that we have here at HUD, what would the panel suggest that given Choice Neighborhoods multi-million-dollar investments in creating neighborhoods of choice, how could we best leverage our investments to engage large and small foundations in many of these communities where HUD is investing its dollars, not just in Choice, but other neighborhoods and other programs across the country? It seems that philanthropy, after 3 to 5 years, loses interest and moves to another area of focus. What is the best way that we can engage the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Motts, the Caseys to put dollars forward in some of our programs that we are being very creative and implementing across this country to create neighborhoods of choice?
I think that's my question.
Yeah, I think tee that up primarily for you. Yes.
Thank you very much for that. And I have to say that the partnership that we've had with HUD over the years, particularly around some of the programs like Choice and the sustainability program, has been tremendous, and I think tremendously helpful for us as a national foundation in terms of being able to work with the knowledge and the funding that HUD has to pilot new ideas, to test new things. You know, the issue for us as a national foundation is that we are trying to find ways to take best practices and help to support replicating them in other places, but we can't support them in all the other places where they need to go because we don't have enough money. I know that sounds a little funny coming from the Ford Foundation, but it's actually true. And you know, the old model in philanthropy, you probably know this, is that we would pilot something ourselves in a local community, and then we'd hope that government would take the program up and fund it nationwide. And we know now that that the government actually doesn't have all the money necessary to do that either. And so we found that the most effective partnerships are three-way partnerships between the government, philanthropy, and the private sector. And I think Choice Neighborhoods has a lot of really excellent examples of that success. I think also that local foundations have a really important role to play in taking lessons like the ones that are being learned from Choice Neighborhoods and making them, taking the best practices and making them a reality in other places.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other comments on that?
Just add on, I mean, I fully agree, and I think to the point of sustainability, it's hard to divorce housing from economic policy. Is that without having a sort of a thoughtful approach to how does one engage and develop jobs and local industries around the housing, ultimately these things simply become one-offs. And so I would try to find a way of integrating the job creation engine, the support for business improvement districts, the attraction of new tenants and investors based on the mixed use, mixed income opportunity for housing. That's a very attractive lever. So being proactive about that, starting that process at the beginning, not waiting till the end, that I think is a real opportunity for sustainability.
And I would add that to the extent that it could be beneficial to the extent that we can expand the investor base beyond just the foundation community or government sector or just the strictly profit-driven private sector element. It could be a space between where there's an emerging field of impact investing, pay for success partnerships, et cetera, where you have people that expect some return on investment, but are also looking to invest in a social good. And if you can bring those folks to the table that will be maybe a little bit more patient, maybe able to accept a little bit of a lower return, you can greatly expand your capital base. There's some very strong potential in that field as well.
Excellent. Mike, thank you. And we have another question.
Yes, good morning. My name is Terrence Taylor. I'm with Congressman Steny Hoyer's office of the 5th Congressional District of Maryland. My question is looking at, and you all touched on it briefly about the zoning issue. I think, how do you strike a balance between local government, because they have the authority to set their zoning policy and planning. So when they're planning, they are building out these communities. It's easy. We always having the challenge of saying, how do you include more affordable housing? And the stigma that affordable housing is getting when it is leading into the NIMBY effects, that we don't want those type of housing in our community. And so I think in the challenge is, how do you help local government to really strike a balance and build the quality of housing without, what they're looking at is, how do they generate revenue? How do they generate revenue to provide goods and services to all residents of a local town or county government? And so have there been any examples where you have this good play with local government when you see it in their zoning policy, even looking outlay years of future land use of land, and so either international or domestically? So if you could drill down on that even more about on the local level, we'd very welcome your insight.
Thanks for that question. I wonder if I could just embellish it a little bit and maybe direct it to Max, for starters, to ask whether the recent evidence or whether there's any additional recent data that gets at the issue of the stigma of affordable housing, and whether there's been significant, I know there have been some significant studies done to kind of tackle that or address that. I wonder if you could tee that up for us a little bit.
Yeah, I think that there is, there's always this problem of NIMBYism, even in a place like New York City, where we have very dense communities. There's outcry in some of the, the farther out neighborhoods in Queens and in Brooklyn that, current residents are concerned about new density in their neighborhoods. But we've been looking at some of the long-term trends in density and find that actually many parts of New York today are less dense than they were 50 or 100 years ago. So there is room for that. I think we're also seeing a shift as some of the millennial generation gets a little bit older, wants to live in denser environments, wants to be able to walk to restaurants and schools and stores. So I think we may be starting to see a shift in people, accepting density.
And more flexible zoning to kind of reflect that, right? To different kinds, different combinations of zoning categories that are.
And as Jonathan was talking about, the importance of mixed-use developments, and I would add to that mixed income developments. In the history of affordable housing development, we were largely developing for first public housing for low-income populations, and then the low-income housing tax credit targets 60% of AMI pretty rigidly, and there's a move now. People are starting to appreciate the need for mixed income developments, and I think there's some policy levers there that we could shift to allow for income averaging, even using the low-income housing tax credit.
Interesting. Good. Okay. John?
No, I was just going to say that, I think a lot of this actually doesn't even require changes in zoning. You could double the FAR in Brooklyn without doing anything to zoning. You could just go out there and, it's 2 stories now, you can make it 4 stories. You don't actually have to go to 10 stories, you can just double the amount of housing that's in Brooklyn. That would be good. It's a 20-minute subway ride to Manhattan, it's not so bad. But just to the zoning idea, my favorite example is an international one, is they have a Chinese city called Nanjing. They have something called a 50-80 rule, which is basically that no less than 50% of the meters squared for a new development has to be in apartments of less than 80 square meters. So small apartments, those are affordable housing. At least 50% of the meters squared has to be 50. But that's not the only thing they did. When they auctioned the land, they set a reserve price, and then they set a cap. And they said, once we get to the cap, because we need to get to the cap, at that point, we will not allow you, the developer, to spend any more money. Instead, we want you to maximize the percentage of of less than 80 square meter apartments. And so they got the private sector to basically design in such a way so they can maximize affordable housing while collecting a huge upside between the difference between the reserve and the cap. And so it's that kind of sort of innovation, I thought, makes a difference.
That's cool.
The political opposition to affordable housing can be powerful in a lot of contexts, and it's very market specific, and the way you tackle that will largely depend on if you're a hot market, a strong market, what the sort of political dynamics are within that market. But just to put, California, they did a study on low-income housing tax credit developments, and they estimated that not in my backyard opposition has added 5% to a 5% increase in costs for those developments that face significant opposition. So that's impactful. And so the question is, how do we combat that? And so first of all, we have to have the data right. We need to be able to have the conversations about what is the appropriate zoning, what is the appropriate level of density, and what are the needs within the community at different income levels. But part of it is just from an advocacy and messaging perspective. We should point out that people have a perception of affordable housing in their head that is not always accurate. If we can point out successful developments, that they look good, that they fit into the community, that there are healthy, stable neighborhoods, that's an important part. Another piece is pointing out that in many cases, the people that would be living in the affordable housing developments are already in the community. And that when you put people that may be in tenuous living situations, maybe bouncing from house to house because of affordability challenges or housing quality challenges, when you put those people in affordable homes that stabilize their living situation, the data shows that their life outcomes improve. Children do better in schools. People have better health outcomes. So saying that, pointing out that in many ways you're not even changing the dynamic, you're just improving the dynamic is an important message to tell as well. There's a number of other messages that are very context sensitive, but I think those are two of the important pieces.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question before we have to transition, and we've got a gentleman standing at the microphone.
Sure. Good morning. My name is John Means. I'm a partner at McKinsey & Company. I promise this isn't a planted question for Jonathan.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, okay.
So, Lisa, building on the idea that you'd presented around building shared values or a common vision for improvement here, what do you or the panel believe the role of corporate social responsibility, voluntary certification programs, or Michael, your idea around impact investing and the role of investor is on moving towards a sense of shared values in the private sector community?
So you're looking for shared values in the private sector. I think there's a lot of momentum building. I think part of what we need to do is to knit it a little more closely to both values and specific action. There's some great examples of that. Enterprise has a campaign that they're working on called Make Room right now that's really fundamentally about the benefits of addressing housing instability. That I think has a broad appeal. There's a number of other campaigns that some of the larger housing organizations in the US have been working on. But I think also some of it really comes down to how people experience things in their local community, back to this issue of NIMBYism. And we found that the places that are most effective in confronting it around the country have several elements. Advocacy is certainly important, but the advocacy has to be across a broad demographic spectrum: young, old, black, white, suburban, urban, and those coalitions actually take time and resource resources to build. It also needs to include some able implementers that are able to listen. So developers that are able to listen, nonprofits that are able to actually hear when people have legitimate concerns about particular developments and make adjustments. And then I think there's also just a fundamental change that we're starting to go through in this country about the narrative around race and class that we have to address head on. A lot of times when people say it's an environmental problem, it's a problem with funding the schools, the evidence doesn't bear that out. What people are really talking about is how they feel fear about the neighbors that are going to be living next to them, and that we have seen certainly in the last year some very difficult implications of things like implicit bias and addressing still our continued inability to address race in this country. And I think that we have to continue to focus on those issues in a productive way.
We're going to need to let Lisa have the last word on that. Wonderful panel, though. We so appreciate all of your comments and all of your hard work leading up to this conversation here this morning. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific conversation already this morning. Thank you so much. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Julian Castro and the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Good morning. How are y'all doing? Are y'all ready for our special guest? Good. Well, so am I. But before we hear from our special guest, I just want to quickly thank all of you for participating in this timely and important conversation. Everyone in this room and watching online represents different sectors and different perspectives. But we're drawn together today by a common belief in the importance of housing. Quite simply, housing is where everything begins and ends. Success in the workplace, in the classroom, and in life often starts with the security of knowing that you have a place to call home every night. That's why, as you've been discussing today, we've got to tackle the affordable housing crisis that's hurting too many of our families. CNN recently did a piece on a husband and wife named Rich and Stacy who have 2 children and who live in San Jose, California. Both of them work, Rich in construction and Stacy is an office receptionist, yet they're living in a homeless shelter because they can't afford the rent in their local area. And they're not alone. Responsible folks are struggling to rent and also to buy homes. Homeownership remains a cornerstone of the American dream, and we've got to preserve this dream. We must act today to shape a better tomorrow. Here at HUD, we're tackling these issues by making home loans more affordable, by attracting private investment to enhance public housing, improving our own operations so that multifamily deals can close faster, and by connecting the folks who live in public and subsidized housing to jobs, schools, and transit options that they need to thrive. Ultimately, housing affordability really is about opportunity. It's about helping parents secure the opportunity to provide for their children, giving those who are homeless the opportunity to get a fresh start in life, providing older Americans with the chance to retire with the dignity and comfort they deserve, and so much more. Through the strength of our partnerships, the power of our ideas, and our hard work, we can all ensure that this opportunity is available to Americans for generations to come. And I know one thing for sure. The man standing next to me will continue to help lead the way. Over the course of his life, he's been a champion for everyday Americans and the underserved. He's ensured that blue-collar Americans have a voice in their government. And he's been a fighter on the issues that bring us together today. That's why it's both a pleasure and a privilege to help welcome him to us today. Please help give a warm HUD welcome to the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. If I'd learned anything over the years I've served in the Senate as Vice President, if I were smart, I would say, I agree and leave. Because it was said incredibly well by the Secretary. I suspect you all agree. And the question is going to be how. By the way, how many of you are Duke graduates in here? Well, congratulations. Why did you pull his hand down? You're from Washington. What's the deal here? Are you from Wisconsin? How many Wisconsin graduates here? I didn't say fans, I said graduates here. It was a heck of a game, wasn't it? It was a heck of a game. And speaking of basketball, I come from Philadelphia, is a suburb of Wilmington, Delaware. And I just want you to know that when I was growing up in the 60s and then into the 70s, there used to be the Big Five in Philadelphia basketball teams, LaSalle, Penn, anyway, the five. And they used to play in a place at the University of Pennsylvania called the Palestra. And this reminds me of the Palestra, because 2/3 are behind columns. You can't see what's going on. That's what it was like watching a game in the Palestra, if any of you from the Philadelphia region. You'd think of all agencies that have a place to meet would be HUD, wouldn't you? I mean, what a heck of a thing to do to y'all here. I mean, but those watching online, you'll get a better view of all this. I've had the great pleasure of working with HUD my entire career since I got elected as a 29-year-old senator. And in a sense, there's a lot of great agencies, but HUD delivers on people's dreams and aspirations, I think in a sense almost more than almost any other agency out there, because as the Secretary said, everything in America is around the home, whether it's rental or ownership. It is security. It is security. That sounds like hyperbole, but it is. It's not just here in America, it's all over the world. And President Johnson, when he established HUD 50 years ago, in his opening statement, he said, "Our task is to put the highest concerns of our people at the center of urban growth and activity. It is to create and preserve a sense of community with others, which gives us significance and security." Significance and security. I think that's how most Americans view housing, view where they live, view and the degree to which they feel a sense of security. That's what continues to drive, I think, all of you today, because all of you are involved in housing in one way or another, whether you work for HUD or you're in the private sector. And I think it drives us all to try to preserve a sense of community. It's about putting people first. Mr. Secretary, when I had the honor of swearing you in last summer, I said that thriving cities are the basis upon which thriving countries rest. And for communities to thrive, there has to be a soul, a center. There has to be a place for people to live. There has to be a place where they can afford to live. There has to be a place they can call home, where men and women and children have the opportunity to be afforded what my dad said and constantly would repeat, that every man, woman, and child is entitled to: a sense of dignity. I would add security to dignity. In my early childhood, home was my grandfather, Ambrose Finnegan's home in Scranton, Pennsylvania. On North Washington Avenue, it was the rock that sustained and, quite frankly, held my larger family together in relatively tough economic times for my dad. Even though he was looking for work, there wasn't enough work in Scranton, we had that rock. We had a home. It wasn't my dad's home. It wasn't our home, but it was a family home. It was a place where when things felt, and you didn't even know why when you were a kid, but you could tell when the adults didn't feel like everything was going right. But you'd walk in the door of my grandpa's home, and you had a bedroom, you had a place, you knew you were okay. It's also, but I also know how important it was for my father to own his own home, to be able to provide on his own for his family, to bring us down to Delaware so we could live under one roof because there were jobs down in Delaware. Remember my dad saying that he'd be gone about a year. I was going into 4th grade. He said we'd be gone about a year. He tried to come home every weekend. It was only 153 miles, and that seemed like going to the moon to me at the time. And, but honey, when we get set up, we'll have a nice place for us to live. First place we moved to was a place that was rental housing, newly built rental housing. I remember even though it was nothing like the home we had originally, I remember pulling up and thinking, my, this is great. We got our place. It's our place. everything that my brothers and my sister and I ever accomplished in life grew out of the four walls of either the rental housing or the home we eventually owned several years later. The home my father was ultimately able to buy that we lived in for over 15 years of my life. And after I got out of law school, I bought that home from my mom and dad. Many of you can tell a similar story. Now, I know this sounds a little like hyperbole, but really, you know, it's about a lot more, as you all know, than bricks and mortars. It's about a lot more than a piece of real estate. It's about home. It's the history of the journey of this country, a middle-class journey, and it starts with a secure home. So much of the long-term wealth and access to opportunity that has occurred in the middle class over the last 70 years has been a result of a family being able to own their own home. Families that own their homes, statistically, they do better. We see this in economic studies which show that home ownership increases the chance that a child will stay in school by up to 9% for low-income families. Home ownership also decreases the chance that a teenage daughter will get pregnant or that a child will have behavioral problems. I think it has to do with, although I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a social worker like my daughter, I think it has an awful lot to do with the parents feeling secure and communicating that sense of security to their children. But it's not just the family in the home that does better. It's the community that does better. When a family buys a home, they're not just buying land and a house, they're buying a financial stake in the community. It's a different perspective. We cared a lot about the community we lived in when we rented, but the community wasn't rushing out to raise money to put flowers in the local Rotary. It's different. It's the financial stake that makes homeowners more invested. There are 15%, homeowners are 15% more likely to vote in elections and 6% more likely to be engaged in solving social problems. I can tell you as a candidate in the state of Delaware, I was a hands-on candidate. I campaigned a great deal in my state. I went everywhere in my state. But toward election day, you didn't go to the apartments to knock on doors to get out to vote, except for senior housing. You went to neighborhoods. That didn't mean you cared less about people in the apartment units, but you knew they were, if you only had 6 hours left, you'd go to the places where you were confident people would likely vote, more likely to vote. Having a stake in your community matters. Some people say that Americans have given up on home ownership. I look at some of the polls. You know, I'm referred to in Washington and other places as middle-class Joe. In Washington, that's not meant as a compliment. That's meant somehow you're not sophisticated if you're middle class. But the truth of the matter is that, you know, it does matter. And I'm told that middle-class folks no longer have the aspiration to own their own homes. I'm told in some polling data that the experts come and brief me on that the middle class has a different view these days. They think it's more rational to rent than own. They think they don't have the same dreams to send their kids to college because of the debt incurred and so on and so forth. I don't think that's a choice. I think that's the option they're faced with. They don't have many other options. They still dream. Let me explain what I mean by middle class. Middle class is being able to own your home eventually and not just rent. Middle class means being able to send your kid to the local park and know they're going to come home safely. Middle class means being able to send your kid to a local public school, and if they do well, you know they have a shot to get to college. And if they get to college, you'll figure out a way to get them there. You'll be able to get them there. And when mom or dad dies, you'll have the capacity to take care of your geriatric parent who's living and maybe bring him or her home with you. And hope that you'll never have to rely on your children when you reach that age. That's sort of classically middle class. When the middle class does well, the wealthy do very well. And the poor have a chance. They have a ladder up. They have a vehicle. So we need affordable rental housing. But we also need access to home ownership. A recent Gallup poll showed that more than 8 out of 10 Americans are either happy owning their own home or strive to own a home. It's still very much a part of the American dream, and as every homeowner knows, a house is more than just that place to live. It's, as I said, it provides permanency. It gives you a sense of being rooted. And it can be a vehicle for building wealth. Not only wealth, it's in many cases the only wealth middle-class families ever are able to accumulate. Today, less than half the American households own stock, and almost 2/3 of the families own a home. Home ownership is how most middle-class families save. It's how most middle-class families build assets. And for many, it's the way you send your kid to college, borrowing it. That's how I got my children to college. And I make a lot of money now as vice president. I make a lot of money. As the president, he was thanking everyone for the sacrifices they made when he got us all in the Blair House after we took office, for the financial sacrifices they made. He looked down at me, he said, except for Joe, he's getting a pay raise. But fortunately, I don't have, I made some strange commitments when I ran the first time, because there was a lot of scandal about Nixon and stocks and the election I ran. I was asked a question in the last debate: what is my position on stock ownership? What is my position on staying in my law firm that I had founded? And what is my position on honoraria? I didn't know quite what honoraria was. It didn't sound good. I said I'd never accept any honoraria from anybody before the Congress, had an interest before the Congress. 2, I'd immediately disinvest in my law firm, which you didn't have to do then. And 3, I'd never own a stock or a bond. And I added the word debenture. I don't know why the hell I did that. It just sounded right. I kept my promise. And by the way, those of you who have children at college age or heading to college, don't make the commitment I made. Don't tell them whatever school they can get into, you'll get them there. It's $68,000 a year in an awful lot of schools right now, private schools. You think I'm joking? I'm not. But look, the way a lot of my generation put their kids through school, and I made a lot of money. I was making $42,000 when I became a senator, then $67,000 when my 2 kids were in school at the same time. But it was to borrow against my home. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do it. Go out and check with people in your own neighborhood if they have college-age kids. Ask them what they miss most about the fact that the bottom dropped out of their home, or they may have lost their home. That's how they planned on getting their kids to school, and many other things. Home ownership is a way to put away money for retirement. It's how you build up wealth to leave to your children. I'm the guy that wrote the, what was at the time fairly controversial when I was a young senator, the reverse mortgage program. And I remember going to my mom and dad and saying, this is a great idea. You'll be able to keep your home, and you'll be able to have extra income because all they had was Social Security and their children. And I remember my dad saying, but if I do that, I'll have nothing to leave to you. I'll have nothing to leave to you. We didn't need him to leave anything to us, but his notion was about ownership, I'll have something to leave to my children. Every time a homeowner makes a mortgage payment and pays down the principal, there's some savings. It's not like it was in the bubble, but it's an investment. Every time a housing value goes up, a homeowner builds some wealth. Every time a homeowner paints the walls or remodels the kitchen, the family's making an investment. Today, Americans have over $20 trillion in wealth in their homes. And older Americans, housing wealth makes up nearly 1/4 of their net worth, just as valuable as company pensions or Social Security. And all this underscores housing's critical role in our economic prosperity and our social fabric. Simply put, home ownership is the cornerstone of middle-class prosperity and access for the poor. But 6 years ago, that cornerstone was being jackhammered. In January of 2009, when the President and I were being sworn in, the housing market was in free fall. Home prices had fallen by then 20% from their national peak, and much more in many parts of the country. Nearly 3 million homes would fall into foreclosure before that year's end. And 1 in 4 homes would be underwater, 11 million homes in total. An awful lot of innocent people were hurt in that recession, the Great Recession. Families who did everything right. They never missed a mortgage payment. They paid every utility bill. They were seeing the values of their home eviscerated. And as the lawns on either side of their home turned brown because of foreclosure or because of loss, their homes plummeted. And many were found underwater and foreclosed on. Many families end up losing their houses, the place they had their wealth. Even those who kept their homes lost equity. So families, as I said, weren't able to borrow or just lost that sense of wealth that gave them a sense of well-being, the wealth factor, as many economists wrote about. And so people began to lose the faith, because as the wealth effect set in, the loss of it, a lot of other conduct and behavior changed in the way people lived their lives, the way people saved and spent money. And so when we took office, we had to take immediate action to stabilize the neighborhood and stem the tide of foreclosure. While in the process, we launched some what were then controversial programs. We launched mortgage modification initiatives that have led, the good news is, they led to more than 8 million homeowners getting the government or private sector relief. The Home Affordable Refinancing Program and FHA's Short Refinance Program were created and created opportunities for 3.5 million underwater borrowers. We established the Hardest Hit Fund, which committed $7.6 billion in resources to states to develop locally tailored programs to reduce blight and assist struggling homeowners in their communities. And that's helped over 200,000 borrowers with programs that reduced principals and helped them bridge the unemployment that they were going through for the moment. We put $7 billion to work fixing up and securing foreclosed or abandoned homes in endangered communities through HUD's Neighborhood Stabilization Program. Like, ma'am, this is like preaching to the choir. I know many of you are all part of this. I've visited these communities all across the nation. Last one was I was in Detroit. The program is projected to support close to 90,000 jobs and treat over 100,000 properties, helping preserve and create not only home ownership opportunities, but affordable rental housing as well. And housing began to rebound, buoyed in part by these efforts. Over the past 2 years, housing prices are up almost 25%. Over 5 million homes owners are no longer underwater. Foreclosure are at their lowest level since before the Great Recession. And even though housing is back, we continue to have to fight for homeowners because a lot are left behind. You know, a lot of people got kicked out of the housing market. They lost everything, so when housing went back up, they weren't part of this. That's why the vast majority of the recovery has gone to the top 1%, not because they're bad guys, not because they did anything wrong, because most of the middle-class people got out of the stock market, and so many of them low and middle-class working people lost the other vehicle they had to accumulate wealth, their home, and weren't able to get back in as things went up. Earlier this year, the President and I, along with Secretary Castro, reduced the insurance and FHA loans by half a percentage point, lowering housing costs by $900 per year for 2 million homeowners, making homeownership more affordable for 250,000 people. $900 a year makes a difference in a lot of families. We forget that in Washington, Democrats and Republicans. Most of the people get who are well-educated and make a decent living. $900 makes a gigantic difference. But we know the answer can't be home ownership alone. We know that the key to preserving our communities, our families, our middle class, though the working class. also rest on widely available, high-quality, affordable rental housing. When there's not enough rental housing available in the community, opportunities decrease. Mobility is vastly restricted. Everything from the extreme cases like domestic violence victims have no place to go and afford to go, to young people being held back from striking out on their own because they can't afford to get into their own housing. And working families pour money into rent that they could be saving up for down payment in a home of their own because the rental prices drive up. I mean, the housing prices get driven up. For millions of families, housing costs are simply too high. In 2013, 7.7 million families with very low incomes paid more than half their income in rent. Half their income in rent. This is driven by the dearth of affordable housing. Right now, there are 8 million more working families looking for an affordable home than there are decent homes available for them to afford. We need to increase the stock of affordable housing. One of the ways to increase that supply of homes that middle-class and working-class families can afford to buy and afford to rent, is for those who need it, is to take a look at the policies that right now stand in the way of home construction in local communities. I was telling my staff of economists as we were preparing this speech that one of the reasons it brought back bad memories, one of the reasons why I ran for the United States Senate as a 29-year-old kid is I never wanted to attend a zoning hearing again. How you think I'm kidding? You know I'm not. War and peace is more soluble than deciding to put in a public housing unit in a neighborhood or a gas station on a corner or a new housing project or a tract housing. I used to be a county councilman. We did zoning. Some of the policies that exist in the county and state level are there for good reasons, but they can have a serious negative impact when they prevent the construction of housing to meet legitimate demands. They decrease housing affordability for working families, increase inequity, reducing skilled workers' access to high-wage labor markets, decrease overall employment by restricting migration, and reduce the growth of our economy by blocking labor migration. That's why in the President's budget, we're proposing $300 million mandatory appropriation for a new local housing policy grant program. This is going to help local communities find ways to reform zoning and density requirements, permitting processes and other land use regulations to create more elastic and diverse housing supply. The President's budget also includes a proposal that would allow states to expand their allocation of competitive low-income housing tax credits, the primary vehicle for affordable housing construction, by up to 50%, by converting private activity bond authority that often goes unused. Our budget includes funding for rental housing assistance to support 4.7 million low-income families, including the restoration of 67,000 housing choice vouchers lost in 2013 due to sequestration. And by the way, this is not, I'm citing these numbers, but you all know it's one family at a time. It's one family at a time. It's the game changer for families. And we're going to continue to press for greater funding for affordable housing programs like the Housing Trust and Capital Management Funds. We're committed to safeguarding the supply of affordable rental housing during future economic crisis through HUD's Tax Credit Assistance Program and Treasury's Credit Exchange Program. Now, this is like Latin and Greek to most audiences, but this is probably the only audience that would understand all those programs. And through the Department of Treasury, we're partnering with states and local housing finance agencies to enable the development and rehabilitation of 40,000 affordable rental units. It all comes down to giving people in this country just a shot. And the single most important shot for families is a place to live securely. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have a base and a foundation and an opportunity. All they're asking for is a chance to raise their families, build their dreams. So it's an honor to stand with you all and to continue the fight for, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, every living heart and hearthstone. Because the heart and hearthstone, family and home, housing and opportunity, are always going to be the core of who we are as a country. And every generation has proven time and again, when given a decent foundation to build their dreams on, the American people never, ever, 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 ever have let their country down. But they got to be brought into the deal. We got to level the playing field a little bit. We got to give them a shot at the most basic thing beyond a job that they're looking for. I've had the chance in my career as a senator and before that to work with so many of you involved in public housing and other housing initiatives, including rental. Interesting thing I found out about most of you. Most of you got into it because not just the opportunity to make a living, but because you cared. Because you cared about the things I'm talking about. Because you get it. You're socially conscious. And you want to make it work. So it really is an honor to get to speak before all of you. But I promise you, the President and I are with you. We are committed to continue to expand the opportunity for average Americans, struggling Americans, to have a hearthstone. To have a hearthstone. Because you all know in your gut, it's the basis upon which almost everything else was built, with families and with individuals. So I thank you all for the work you do. I think we have a great opportunity. I just came from a prayer breakfast in the White House, and I said, you know, Lent's over, Easter has occurred, Passover is about to finish. And what's it all about? All of it. It's all about hope. It's all about promise in both of the great confessional faiths. I'm not turning this into a sermon, I promise you. But it really is about giving people a chance. And this is the best chance we can give people other than a chance for a job, is a chance to be able to have a hearthstone, rental or owned. You're the key to it. I promise we're in on the deal. Thank you all for listening. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for your work. Thank you.
Check one. That works. Test 1, 2.
Awesome. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Lynn Ross again, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development here at HUD. We certainly had some excitement, and we're glad to see so many of you stick with us for what is our final panel, but a really exciting panel. So we are in the home stretch of our program, and we're just about to enjoy our Moving to Solutions panel. This morning, we really drilled into the evidence, really understanding the drivers on housing cost and what it's going to take to expand housing affordability. So this panel is that translation. So what is that evidence telling us? How is it working on the ground? You're going to hear from a really fantastic and diverse panel about real-world solutions that they have in place. And as you can see, they're raring to go already on stage with me. So I am just going to remind you that we are live tweeting, and same for your questions. So please tweet to PDR events and use the hashtag housing opportunity. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ben Hecht, who is the president and CEO of Living Cities. Take it away, Ben.
Great. Thank you very much, Lynn. So we are going to try to take a through line from this morning's conversation about what the evidence is and talk to some of the folks who are working around the world and the US on how are they solving the problems that all of that data and evidence shows in new, creative, or old and creative ways, but to try to really get to scale. So let me introduce the panelists, and then we are going to give each panelist about 5 minutes to highlight the 3 things that they think are the most exciting and encouraging solutions that are out there about translating that data into policy and practice. And first on my left is Jan Mischke, a senior fellow at McKinsey, who's going to talk about what solutions they've seen in the report that you heard referred to this morning around the globe to really turn this problem into practice. Then we're going to go, so we tried to be macro to micro in a way. And so then we're going to go to the man with the most interesting job in America, Arthur Jameson, the Director of Housing and Revitalization for the City of Detroit. And then we're going to hear from Cynthia Parker, who runs one of the most productive housing developers in the country, Bridge Housing, the president and CEO of Bridge Housing, Cynthia Parker. And then finally, Betsy Spencer, last but not least, the Director of Neighborhood Housing and Community Development for one of the fastest growing cities in America, Austin, Texas. And so they're going to bring you, from their perspective, some of the solutions that they find most promising. And with that, Jan, to you.
Thank you, Ben. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer to housing. We've seen many different things being applied in different places around the world. But for sake of brevity, let me focus just on land, and specifically activating idle land, transit-oriented development, and property or land value capture. When we look at 2,400 cities and their affordability gaps, we see that 2/3 of that gap is actually concentrated in just 100 cities worldwide. These cities tend to be large, fast-growing, and constrained in their expansion in some way, which usually makes land up to 50, sometimes 60, 70% of total unit cost. And unless we find ways to bring that down to the more normal 20% of unit cost in more affordable places, it's very difficult to leave a mark on affordability. London would be maybe a case in point. City needs 70,000 more units per year, struggles to deliver more than half of that rate because it has a green belt around, it has fairly mid-level densities, it's not living up to the scale that it needs to provide. Some cities have found ways to activate idle land within city boundaries. So Saudi, for example, found 40 square kilometers of prime land idle within cities and is now applying idle land taxation to bring it forward to the market. Or on the public lands topic, Istanbul, or more broadly Turkey, has identified even 40,000 square kilometers of underused public land and has already developed 500,000 homes on those and more to come. But at some stage, you also need to develop the city further, and you need to do so in a transit-oriented way because low-income families usually don't have cars. Within city boundaries, it's worth looking at cities like Seoul. Seoul has actually varied floor area ratios within city boundaries and very small vicinities by a factor 8, just depending on proximity to transit hubs and to major roadways. That's how extreme it can get. Or you develop further outside, bring in the transit, the train lines, and so on. Hong Kong is the most well-known example, expanding into the new territories at 140,000 homes per year, bringing in the rail infrastructure. But you can also see that in my hometown, Zurich, happening in slow motion over the centuries. New infrastructure, but also redevelopment and providing the affordable housing, however, is expensive. And many of you working in policy know that public budgets, and even more so city budgets, tend to be constrained. They are not endless. But we should not forget that bringing in this infrastructure and redeveloping city areas is at least as valuable as it is expensive. Near new transit hubs, usually property values rise by 30 to 60%, and can be factors of that if you develop to higher densities. So it's very well known that Singapore, for instance, purchases land before redevelopment and then sells only on leasehold, capturing the value for the public at large. But also in the Western Hemisphere, if you look at, for instance, the city of Barcelona, in the La Marina redevelopment, they increased floor areas from 1 to 2.4, and that was sufficient to get the developer to pay for most of the infrastructure needs, as well as providing 50%, 50, of units at sub-market affordable rates. So activating idle land, transit-oriented development, and capturing the value associated with it.
Super. And I'm glad you focused on the land thing started, because what I meant to do, and I got caught up in the excitement of introducing everybody, was that I think that you'll hear some themes through these conversations that were the same themes you heard earlier today. Land is one of them. How do you actually get more from the land? And you'll hear across these four speakers the different ways that's being done. The other way, of course, is financing. How can you use new and different ways of financing in order to get to address the challenges of supply? And then how can we really reduce the cost? Some of you, like me, worked at Enterprise when it was called Enterprise Foundation. That was started by Jim Rouse. And those who knew Jim early on, his whole thing was, we have to figure out how to do it just for a lot less cost. And we figured out that, unfortunately, it wasn't the only answer. But it still has to be part of the solution. And we're going to hear people talking about how can we really address the costs, and what are some new ways to try to get people to focus on getting larger numbers of units done. Can we really measure and hold ourselves accountable for measuring ambitious goals in this area? You're going to hear that from many of these speakers as well. So look for those, and then hopefully you'll have questions about those as well. So Arthur was the head of housing and community development for the state of Massachusetts, and then for the last 6 months has been doing a similar job for the state of Detroit, Michigan. And so we're really interested to hear your learnings from those two places, Arthur.
Sure. So I'll give you three numbers that I'll focus on. One is 10,000 multifamily housing units. The second one is $3,000. And the third one is $250 a week. 10,000 units. In 2012, December, Governor Patrick announced, or then Governor Patrick announced a 10,000 unit goal for production of multifamily housing around the state. This was important because it was the product of months of work of a working group that I was leading. That was trying to develop a message that we could share with the leaders of a series of small and medium-sized cities around the state, where Massachusetts has really struggled over the years with having inappropriately, sort of not having adequately, appropriately zoned land for the production of multifamily housing. It's particularly difficult to get that housing to be produced in areas of high opportunity around the state. So the governor and the secretary needed a goal that would help us figure out what the problems are in the delivery system of housing, and give people, give developers, and give, most importantly, the audience that contained local leaders the sort of stimulus they needed to make changes in the way that they governed and sold land in their portfolios. So that goal was very successful. I'm pleased to say we won an award for it, but what the few things that came out of it that were critically important: setting a metric that we were all forced to try to drive communities for, create a set of positive incentives. One, it caused each of the localities to decide, look, you know, that's great, I don't really care about that, but I want a driveway to my new industrial park. You're not going to get that unless you're putting some numbers on the board against the 10,000 units. Second thing it caused us to do was look a little bit at the way that the city and in the different states, different parts of the state, calculated the production of housing. For example, almost no adaptive reuse units, specifically they're developed in some of our old mill towns, were being counted because of the way that local organizations and the revenue calculators looked at that kind of housing. So creating a metric really drove the process. $3,000. Another initiative in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was a social innovation finance project. The state offered a series of dollars that are effectively fungible for other sources of income that the state has. So by way of example, it costs about $6,000 in Medicaid to have a homeless person on the street. $3,000 in state contribution and about $3,000 with a federal contribution. A great data source was sort of harvested and mined by the team over at the Harvard SIF lab, and they came to us and said, look, if you can use these $3,000 to advance your cause, what would you do? RFP was released, we selected the Mass Housing and Shelter Alliance. They came up with a SIF project, which was going to house 500 to 600 of the longest stayers, the chronically homeless individuals in the state, and a package that included the release of some of the restrictions around the dedication of shelter money, $3,000 worth of savings that were generated each time that you could measure that a person had been off the street for a year, and then a small number of locally generated vouchers. Massachusetts has a voucher system, just like HCV. So that package of benefits came together and made it possible for them to get private investment. And in December, that project was launched. I was the negotiator with the development team that put it together. If it hadn't been for data, we would not have been able to get the key piece of that to happen, which was convincing the managed care entities in the state that had contracts with the state that actually this was going to save them money while also providing better service to homeless individuals. So 250 is my last number. I'm only 6 months in the city, and I've got many tales to tell, but as I was joking with Lynn, I wouldn't have been invited for the work I've done in Detroit yet. So, so just to talk about that briefly, 250, our mayor has cabinet meetings every week during which every single cabinet member has a metric or series of metrics that they have to report out on a weekly basis. You get to select them, but once you've selected them, you're going to be hoisted by that petard at some point during the time. But what's critical about that is that every single week we're talking about how long it takes for police to respond, how long it takes for fire to respond, how many fires there were, and more applicable to this conversation, we're having a conversation about how many dangerous and exposed houses have been demolished. We're in a conversation about how many new auction sales have taken place and how many new financings have been done on auction houses offered by our land bank. So again, using metrics as a way to drive the conversation and drive performance in your staff, I think has been working in government and the private sector and development for about 20 years. I guess I've never seen quite this emphasis on metrics, but I will say that I think it is beginning to yield results that I can see, and hopefully residents of the city can see.
Super. Cynthia.
Sure. I think I'm going to agree with what's been said earlier, but metrics are incredibly important. For Bridge, we set a goal for ourselves over the 30 years that we've been in existence as a nonprofit. We've created about 15,000 units of affordable housing, and we own and manage a little over 10,000 of those units. A couple of years ago, we set a goal of doubling the size of the company over a 5-year period, and this was during a period of time when California had essentially eliminated most of its subsidy sources through redevelopment. And I'm very happy to say that we're on track. Right now, we've got about 2,000 units under production. We're expecting to have well over 6,000 units ahead of plan, produced by the time the 5-year period ends. But we're also working very hard to collaborate with others in our network and across the country to try to expand the supply. We really need to stop treating affordable housing as a boutique industry and doing these sort of 60 unit, 50 unit, all very important, but if you really want to attack the problem, you have to look at it from a scale process. So from the standpoint of looking at solutions, I think there are a number of them. One of them is financing. Bridge helped lead the way with the Housing Partnership Network and created HPET, the Housing Partnership Equity Trust, which is a nonprofit REIT. I chair that group. And we have assembled, thanks to some of our partners, the Ford Foundation, amongst others, we've assembled about $150 million in capital. That's non-tax credit equity that has allowed for both equity and debt financing to acquire affordable units across the United States. And thus far, we're about, again, here's another 2-year, 3-year mark. We've acquired about 1,500 units. So this is done collectively with 11 other members who are nonprofits, who are all members of this trust. And we've bought shares and we're helping to produce the units. And then Bridge on its own has also been acquiring off-market equity, in other words, high net worth individuals, foundations, to allow us to move in more quickly. Part of the problem with affordable housing is you're assembling all this financing sources, and it takes 3 times the period that a normal market rate developer would take. And it also takes the same amount of time, and you lose out when you're bidding on land, when you're bidding on existing product. So financing, I think, is very, very important, and to think outside the box. And then secondly, I guess I would agree on the bending the cost curve concept that I think Enterprise and ULI, I was on that committee, and we've really taken that to heart. So for example, trying to think outside the box, we have now at Bridge, we're in production doing our first 200-unit development project, and we're pulling permits in the next 2 weeks for another 385 units of mid-rise modular construction. So interestingly enough, these are both projects that have project labor agreements in force. So we've had to work with the labor unions to get signatory authority in the factory. And we're building these units, they're boxes, thinking outside the box to build a box. But we are actually raising those units, and they're quite attractive and have met design review. So a couple of examples, I think very important. Also, not to forget, not to say this is also part of production. Community. I think it's so important that we also think about the residents and the community and the neighborhoods that we're trying to create. We're involved in a number of public housing redos through RAD or through choice-like redevelopment projects everywhere from Los Angeles, San Francisco, other localities on the West Coast. And I think we have found that you can't really be successful unless you really make sure that the residents have the opportunities to success. So much like what the Vice President said this morning, really thinking about how do we give opportunity through housing. It's not just the unit, it's also the community.
So Cynthia, I was going to wait to ask anybody any questions until everybody went, but can you give us a feel for what you're seeing on a cost differential on the modular versus the non-modular, or any way to think of it?
Absolutely. You know, our headquarters are in San Francisco, so right now we are the most high-cost housing market in the United States. And so I can tell you, I'm doing a lot of units, the average cost in the city of San Francisco is about $660,000 per unit for a multifamily. It's fairly shocking. That's a new construction, but that's, you know, the permitting, the cost of the land, you know, the impact fees, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So it all adds up. It's huge. What we were able to do in the Bay Area with our first modular project is save about 15% in hard costs. So that translated, you take out land, you take out soft costs, translates into about $80,000 a unit. So, you know, when you think about that, over a 100-unit development, that's $8 million. You know, that's a gap that can be closed quickly with that cost curve. It comes fully delivered. It's very interesting. The showers are in, the cabinets are in, it's all done. So it's one way, I think, of trying to address that.
Excellent. Betsy, in many ways, you're going to cover some of the same points but in a very local application.
Correct.
In Austin. Obviously, we also know you worked in San Antonio at a local level, but what have you seen as the kind of key things to drive these practices, this data into practice and policy?
Thanks, sure. So having accurate needs assessment at a very local level is incredibly important. Austin is a very engaged community, and so we take the opportunity with every 5 years with our consolidated plan process to retain a consultant to do a very comprehensive housing market study. So it's very local, it's very current at the time. In 2009, we had a gap of 38,000 units that were needed for very low income families and individuals. This last year, it grew to 48,000. So our gap is, which is not surprising, I'm sure, to anyone in the market that Austin's in. But having that very current local data is very important because it helps our policymakers and all the advocates with information that they can share to help create better policies. We also have a very strong community engagement process in Austin. This last comprehensive housing market study, we were able to survey over 5,000 families or individuals in the city on their housing choice wants and needs, which again is very important. We're losing a lot of low-income families to the suburbs because there's just no housing available to them. Transportation is a big issue in Austin, Texas. We don't have adequate public transportation, so a lot of low-wage job earners are having to live outside, and so it just adds to the congestion. So having the housing market study has been a great tool to be able to inform folks. A couple of tools, we try to employ every tool possible, and we've had some very smart people before I ever got to Austin, Texas, to really try to have a wide variety of tools available. One tool that's been very beneficial is general obligation bond funds. In 2006, the community passed a $55 million allocation for general obligation bond funds, specifically for affordable housing. And so in that, we were able to help finance about 3,400 units, 2,500 were affordable. We prioritize folks at very low and low income. About half the funds go to benefit folks that are 30% and below, about the other half go to 50% and below. So we target for those long-term restrictions for very low and low income folks. Interesting, if and when you're going to do that, we were able to employ another consultant to do an economic analysis of those funds. Of the $55 million, we leveraged almost $200 million of private investment. That was a tremendous story to be able to tell the general public because they obviously have to be, the general election has to create those. And so without that information, it can be hard for folks to want to understand why they want to invest their money. So it also created almost 3,000 jobs, just construction work during the course of that. The analysis indicated that probably over 10 years, the original $55 million will leverage or generate almost $500 million of investment to the overall community. So again, when you can tell the story of not just housing, all of us struggle with the NIMBY part. I mean, it's no different in Austin, Texas. But when you can tell folks a story that you're generating jobs and income and leverage to the entire community, that was a much more palatable story. We were fortunate in 2013 to get another $65 million allocation of general obligation bond funds. So the commitment of local resources, our federal funds obviously are limited, and so when the local funds demonstrate a tremendous commitment. Another tool or tools that we utilize, we have developer incentives and density bonus programs. We do not have inclusionary zoning in Texas, so that's not an option for us. So we have to utilize the developer incentive and density bonuses to incentivize private developers. Again, that's even with the $65 million that we currently have, it's never enough money really to be able to do all the work that we need to do. Additionally, we don't really count on the density bonus programs in and of themselves to target very low and low income households. The density bonus programs are going to provide an opportunity for the private market to create the units for a middle income or the working families. So we've been fortunate across the board with all of our density bonus programs. We've generated over 4,000 units. No, I'm sorry, 4,000, and about $3 million in fees. We have a laundry list of different developer incentives based on the area and or the priority. Some of them generate fees, some of them have on-site, some of them have both. But combined, and we're just starting to see those units come online. So again, it was really the vision of folks probably closer to 2000, 2005 that created a lot of these programs, and we're just now realizing the benefit, biggest benefit being that the private market is paying for these units. Finally, utilizing publicly owned land. If any of you have been to Austin, Texas, you may have seen the Miller development. The Miller development was originally an airport, and when the airport was being relocated, it left over 700 acres of publicly owned land. It's a massive redevelopment of a very large tract of land, which originally was in an area that was really struggling. In less than 10 years, it's an amazing award-winning redevelopment activity, and the commitment in that project is 25% of the units must be affordable, either home ownership or rental. And so that has been a tremendous effort of redevelopment of publicly owned land. What's coming next for us? We're exploring things like TIF financing. We've not utilized TIF financing for affordable housing. We're looking at that definitely in the concert of, we have a housing, job, transit action team. Transportation remains a big issue for us, obviously employment, and if we can utilize our TIF funds for the infrastructure expense, that's our big ticket, is where we need to be able to do that, to create these nodes of opportunity for housing, jobs, and transit to be located. We're not like Washington, D.C. We're still a little bit spread out. Again, density is an issue for us. We're going through a land development code rewrite. Our land development process is somewhat arduous, and so we've employed a consultant to redo a land development code. We've got to be able to get better even at density. The D word's kind of scary for some folks in Austin, Texas. But we've got to be able to utilize density to drive down some of the costs, and then just make the development process easier, which will reduce costs, and then lots of different alternatives, accessory dwelling units, and we're trying to skin this cat in every different way that we can. We're also working with Green Healthy Homes Initiative. That's really for us on our service delivery. If we can streamline our service delivery to where we're not all serving folks 10 different times, again, we're looking to see if we can achieve the affordability both on the developer side and then on the homeowner side. Household affordability, last year when we stopped saying affordable housing and we started saying household affordability, and we really started looking at the cost of the transportation and the housing and the utilities and the medical bills and everything else, that really became a concept that the average person, everybody can get a handle on that.
That's an interesting connection to the earlier conversation this morning too about the story I think Lisa Davis raised. It's like telling a story that it's beyond the housing. I want to talk about a couple more things and then open it up for questions. But Jan talked about it, I think Jonathan earlier this morning. The whole thing, the Economist last week had the cover story about land. It does seem like there is a reality that is sinking in, even in our country, as somebody said, we'll always get it right after we've tried everything else. And it seems like you all are involved in interesting ways that land is being used to address this problem. You talked about Austin. I know, Cynthia, you've been involved in some large-scale redevelopment or setting aside chunks of land to be able to do this. Want to add anything to what you're seeing that you hope is a trend that's different than you've seen in the past on the use of land?
Well, I do think that the public sector has a role to play, and that it's really important to have the public sector completely committed to this, and that's not always the case in every community, but certainly I think that where it is making a difference. We're seeing, in our sense, we're doing a lot of work with public housing authorities where we're taking older public housing stock that needs to be replaced on a one-for-one basis, but then also mixing incomes with that. So very similar to Choice, although we know that Choice is a very limited resource. So we've got a development in Los Angeles that's 81 acres with the Housing Authority of Los Angeles. In San Francisco, 38 acres in the city, which is very interesting from an income equality standpoint, where we have a public housing development that's kind of been surrounded by a fence, a chain link fence, next to multi-million-dollar homes on the other side of that fence. land that the city desperately needs. And so we're adding from 600 units, making it 1,545 units, which will be middle income and market rate. Yeah. Plus the replacement of the public housing. So, you know, really trying wherever you can to utilize those public resources.
And are you seeing a lot of that led by you pushing them, or are they pulling you, public sector pulling you in, or a combination of both?
It's usually a combination of both. I mean, honestly, I you know, most of my day is spent pushing government at one level or another, you know, all levels. Yeah. But honestly, I think that we have some very, very progressive governmental partners who are pulling us into some of these things.
And how about cost reduction? We talked about the modular work that they're doing in Bridge. Everybody has an idea of how they're going to rebuild housing in Detroit, I know. And you guys obviously are working with governments all over the world on how can they drive down the costs. What are you seeing that you think the audience would find promising on the cost, reducing the cost of development side?
I mean, I would just say maybe from the Massachusetts experience more than the Michigan experience that we spend a lot of time looking at modular housing in Massachusetts, and we don't, although we have very, very high costs, especially in Boston, our costs don't approach yours. And so the net number and differential when you've got the actual box landed and connected wasn't big enough, really, I think, you know, for us to make some of the investments that were being requested, like investing in a modular production facility or expanding other modular production facilities in the state, which is something we looked very closely at. So that would be the experience there. I mean, for us on both the land and the cost standpoint, we have Detroit as an unusual situation where we've got very abundant land, and we've got and our costs are not terribly high compared to other places. Now, I think as was said earlier in an earlier panel, that doesn't mean that it's affordable necessarily to people in the city.
For those who are on the webcast, they're making an announcement over the system, so we're waiting for the announcement to be over. It's almost over.
It sounded a lot like me, so I was worried that some reverb.
It sounded kind of like either Vice President Biden or God speaking from the...
It did.
All right,
so
Arthur, sorry about that.
So anyway, but again, in Detroit, I would say we've got, the issues are different. You know, what to do with areas of high vacancy where there is little housing, and, you know, what to do, how to reuse those areas in collaboration with the community is a different kind of issue. I mean, the kind of things we've encountered on the cost side have to do with just not having a deep pool of either projects or even sort of general contractors are able to do multifamily housing product. And so if a big project has booked all those great GCs and their sub vendors, you know, you don't have a deep pool of people who are ready to come in and absorb that. Other markets, I know they've got much deeper union halls and other resources available to solve that problem. So we are having a bit of a positive experience now with some new housing starting, but developers have talked a lot about can't find the right GC. This project's getting priced a little bit higher than it should be because no one has done this product before here. So those are some of the issues we have on that front.
Very interesting. Jan, what are you seeing on either the cost reduction side or the interesting land innovations?
Yes, so if maybe on the cost, we've been speaking to construction companies, developers, and also cities around the world, and usually there is an opportunity to save like 20 to 30% of cost even when you go for high standardization and ideally even fully modular construction. Some players in India, for instance, who are now actually even targeting construction costs as low as $200 per square meter build-up room area. That might not quite be to the level of US standards, but this kind of how far you can push the boundary. But The interesting thing about this is usually it becomes economical from about 3,000 to 5,000 units per year within a like 2-3 hours radius, which makes it feasible to actually have 2 truckloads back and forth per day. And that is a scale that just not too many places provide. But if you do, either on the side of developers consolidating, but also on the public sector's hand actually helping do that, you not only lower the construction cost, but you also compress schedules by 40 to 50%. And that massively reduces financing costs.
Sure.
And you can also intelligently play that with de-risking developments. So that you say, okay, you not only have this scale, but actually we have the stock of, I think, 48,000 people, for instance, in Austin.
Right.
We, as the government, can actually guarantee you demand over the next 10 years for 4,000 units per year. Here are the names and addresses of the people. So a lot of things that you can do to actually massively bring down the risk of development, and this way the cost of capital of development.
Interesting. Any questions from the audience? I think we still have a few minutes. If you have a question, come up to the mic.
Not a question, but
sure, please.
the lady from Austin.
Hold on one second. Get to the mic so the people online can hear you.
Just holding my place while I was in motion. The lady from Austin speaks well of what they've been able to do in developing low-mod housing. 30 years ago, Austin led the nation in terms of how an owner would be willing to rent to persons of low income because they developed an arbitration system where when the unit is first available, the owner selects a person to view the unit, the would-be tenant selects a second person, and the two of them then selects a third person. And they have a form which they go through the apartment or the house, and they look at all the facilities, and they check off the condition because they operate the switches and so forth. When the tenant leaves, that same committee comes back into the house to see what the condition is as time and usage would refer. That's a very significant process, seldom developed or used elsewhere. But as you know, a big zoning issue is low mod and what becomes of my property if I rent to you. So the Austin method or process is one that I think could be used widely throughout the country, and we'll talk about Miller another time.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hello, I'm Jane Vincent. I'm the regional administrator with HUD in the Mid-Atlantic. One of the things I heard one of you mention was a comment about needing to put significant investment into affordable housing, and that some of our smaller boutique programs, I think you used 50, 60 units, is not really going to move the needle very fast. I wonder if you could comment about that statement, which is true in terms of the breadth of the work we need to do, compared to the marketability of projects or affordable housing developments in smaller communities or places where 50 or 60 units might be more than the market can stand, say like in a rural community.
Sure.
I think that might be me.
Sure.
And I don't mean to belittle 60 units at all. I mean, Bridge is working in 3 states now on the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. And we're engaged right now in a very small community in Oregon, which is called Cornelius. It's a teeny sort of suburban ex-agricultural community, and looking at a 60-unit development that will be co-located with a library. And so we're thinking quite hard about what's the saturation point, but also knowing how significant this particular development project will be to that community because they have not had much affordable housing developed there. I do think that 60 units can be quite impactful in a lot of places, and I can tell you that the last 60-unit development we did in the city of San Francisco, where our headquarters were, we built 60 units as a single freestanding development project in the Tenderloin neighborhood and had 2,700 qualified applicants waiting to get into that housing. So
but
every,
I think that's
every
your
little
point,
bit helps.
though, right?
That's right.
Your point is that not to be satisfied with the 60 in an environment that needs 2,500. In certain small towns, 60 may be oversupply. And I think what people are realizing is we need a very different system to address the actual problem. You know, what's the denominator of the problem and how fast can we get to it, as opposed to let's just incrementally add to it and hope the denominator, you know, goes down by magic.
Yeah, it won't.
Maybe just kind of building on that, one thing that I find very interesting is also what you mentioned about the metrics, and we see that in a few, unfortunately, too few cities around the world now experimenting with delivery unit type approaches regarding housing. Because it's a very complex, multifaceted problem where you do need the construction permits, the land, the financing, later on electricity, maintenance, all those things need to come together. No single department can meaningfully oversee it, including all the policies and so on involved. So actually creating a delivery unit that reports straight to the mayor, but then also is targeted on very hard numbers.
Right.
Where it's not only like, yeah, we have this program and that program, and then we see what comes out, but you actually say, we need 48,000.
Yeah.
We give ourselves 5 years. Every year or every month, actually, we see how many units have been built.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference.
It does, and we see that everywhere. That was so powerful about the governor saying 10,000, because oftentimes more is the goal, as opposed to something that you hope is going to make a material difference to the problem. Next question.
Arthur, my name is Barbara Burnham from Seasoned Partners, formerly of LISC, and a Bostonian. Good to see you here. You are in a city now that is the crown jewel of vacant property. And right now I'm working with the Rhode Island Housing Finance Agency on vacant property in Providence, which is the new mayor's top priority to move idle property into usefulness. Since you're looking at literally neighborhoods, vacant neighborhoods rather than just vacant units, I wonder what suggestions you'd give to all of us for how to stage in the various ways of looking at vacant property, and particularly in your case, given the fact that there's been so much foreign investment that's come in.
Great question.
Sure. So I guess what I'd offer is one of the reasons that it's a particularly, I think, good time to be working in Detroit is we had a award-winning plan that was, you know, very nationally popular but locally kind of controversial, called the Detroit Future City Plan, which really articulated some very specific ways to go with areas of high vacancy. I would say that after working in the gateway cities in Massachusetts, actually with the supportive living cities, and others, you know, you have these high vacancy areas, but there's nothing really on the scale of Detroit. That said, in Detroit, it's still not quite as, the tenure is very mixed. There's vacant sites there that are broken up into many small pieces, and it's hard to really aggregate them, although we have some instruments that are unique to Detroit, I think, to do that. I guess what I'd say the plan has said, and we're now trying to operationalize, is the plan has said, take your areas of high vacancy and sort of approach it kind of in an Olmstedian way and say, what's the right way to turn many of these places into resources and places that help the outlying areas that are stronger get stronger and build around. So there's a few places right now that we're looking at where you know, one area was very heavily affected by a recent presidentially declared disaster last year, and that the Brightmoor neighborhood is, you know, frankly at a rural level. It looks rural today, and the thought is, are there ways to build from that and create a development project, maybe not a residential or housing or office project, but a landscape project that combines landscape with stormwater and other things to sort of make that area beautiful. It's not that far from an area of some stability where there's a chance to develop more housing. So one of the things we're looking at is there a landscape project there that would be appropriate? In other places, we're looking at energy generation as another way to, again, take those areas of high vacancy, work with the community, and turn them into areas that either generate energy or generate recreation or other things that are needed in the community, and then think about how to build around them. That was the notion. I think we're trying to now operationalize it into projects so that people in the community feel like they're invested in the new recreational resource or open space or forest. Again, it plays differently in the community. I think people were very, Detroiters are very proud of their city, no matter what anybody says about it, and we're very enamored of a particular kind of development, which in today's marketplace just doesn't have the same value that places with a different pattern of development have. But I do think we have a chance to have outstanding and special new areas that if they're reconceptualized, really will be the anchor for the growth that we'd like to see in other parts of the city.
Fabulous. Next question, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for your comments and your sharing your just impressive experiences. I am asking the panel to think forward, looking into your crystal ball. By the way, my name is Terry Montague. I'm here with HUD, the Office of General Counsel, formerly with Enterprise. As we're thinking about affordable housing production and expanding supply, I'm wondering, are we doing anything new and innovative building into the new production and extensive rehabs that help us with affordable housing preservation down the line? As you know, for many years, LIHTC deals have been the real engine and bringing the private sector and private capital into the affordable housing sector. But the 15 and 30-year income and use restrictions hangs out there. So part of the question is, how are you perceiving the horizon? And in what ways are we using additional land structures or deal structures to help assure that we don't have a crisis on the back end once we build these new projects?
Super. Okay, so why don't we give everybody a chance to answer that, and then I think we'll close off the panel with that. You want to start?
Sure. I would
Arthur?
say that when I came to Detroit, that one of the things, we have a preservation crisis in Massachusetts. When I came to Detroit, I did not expect us to have a preservation crisis. Perhaps I should have thought harder about that.
Right.
But we have, we expect to lose about 20,000 units of either YTEC or rental assistance supported units over the last 5 years. In the next 2 years, we could lose 5,000 of those units. And we had the luxury of having the Secretary visit the city of Detroit last week, and the mayor was introducing the new locally impaneled board for the Housing Commission, which is our housing authority. And he talked pretty passionately about how important it is. If our number one goal is to retain Detroiters and then attract new Detroiters, it starts with retaining people who are currently living in these and recapitalizing our portfolio. That portfolio is unusually sort of in two categories. One, you know, classic multifamily of the 70s and 80s in pretty well located locations, and B, it's YTEC developments, which are in a wide range of places, a lot of scattered site, single family. So as we look at that, recapitalizing it is critical. It's critical to our mission. We don't have anything novel that. I guess I would just say that thinking it's a huge issue for us. We don't have anything new. We don't have the same market demands and threats to that housing. That would be the only thing I'd say that you might have in San Francisco or Boston, where the marketplace is so strong that it just wants to subsume those units. It's not quite as bad that way for us.
No, I think that that's one thing where the federal government, HUD, for example, could really help the development community, the affordable development community, preserve housing. We have targeted specifically expiring use properties in the states that we're working in, and have a database of every HUD expiring 202, Section 8, 236, you name it, number, and LIHTC deal, and are actually trying to go in and acquire before they come to market. So we've internally developed an expertise with a kind of a SWAT team approach of being able to come in, sort of parachute due diligence on those deals as we start to acquire. And it's really tricky to do. I can't underscore that enough. I had to, you know, we had to quarter our group in order to get them to go in, because you're really looking at restructuring somebody else's very complicated deal. And, you know, it's like no deal is better than your deal. So, you know, here it is, it's somebody else's mess. And so we've really tried to understand that and be able to move quickly, and moving quickly is what it's all about. I think the government could help train other developers to do that, focus on that, offer resources for that. Sometimes part of the problem is also getting the authorities who are part of the underlying debt structure to refigure. And then I think over the long term, also being able to put the capital back into the property so that it can extend its useful life even further. I mean, San Francisco, I don't want to leave everybody with the thought that everything that Bridge touches costs $660,000. That's new construction in the city of San Francisco. That is not every other market throughout America or the West Coast. And we have, we've been able to acquire units using the preservation approach for much, much less, under 6 figures per unit.
So do we have to say one sentence about RAD, though? I mean, I think RAD and rental assistance generally, categorically, is an area that can help us. Rental assistance generally is a category that can help us significantly recapitalizing those properties.
Agreed.
All right. Betsy, you get a minute. Jan, you get a minute. We're done.
Very good. Obviously in Austin, preservation is huge. The 48,000 unit gap assumes we don't lose anything of what we've got. So our council last year created our newest homework assignment is preserve 20,000 units over 20 years. So we're actively working on a strike fund. We don't, an additional source of funds. I'm hoping to seed a preservation strike fund with some of the general obligation bond funds. Clearly one of our biggest challenges, we don't have enough banks, to be perfectly honest, really contributing. So I'm hoping that we can get a preservation strike fund operated by a CDFI. The government, we're terrible at doing things fast. And so we need someone else who can have the money there available so that the nonprofits they can't compete in this market. I mean, you can't even get a property on the market before it's already picked up and bought. So we're probably about a year out, but that's our goal right now is a preservation strike fund.
Jan, the last word.
Let me then focus, so you have preservation in kind of financial and deal terms. You have preservation, say, in maintenance and DK. And let me focus on the latter. And there you see, like in a lot of markets, southeastern New York most notably, have set up all kinds of low-income ownership associations that make, where people make mandatory contributions to the maintenance costs and so on that will occur eventually. It strikes me that in a lot of developed countries, public housing, you would think that the public is somehow grown up. It kind of seems to need a law as well to put money aside for preservation. I think there's no excuse for letting your assets decay. There's no innovation, it's just making it happen. It's no excuse.
Perfect way to end the session. Thank you very much, everybody, part of the panel.
So thank you so much. Can you just join me in giving a big round of applause to this panel and to all of our speakers today? So we covered a tremendous amount of ground, and I know that I learned a lot. So as I was listening to this last panel, I was trying to distill what I learned into 5 words, and there's a lot packed behind each of these words: evidence, policy, narrative, partners, and action. So lots packed behind that. I think those are some key themes that we heard about throughout the day. I know that I'll be thinking about that as I leave this room, and I hope that you will be as well. Just a reminder that all of our event resources, including background on all of these great speakers, is available right now on howtouser.org/housing affordability. And also an archive of today's webcast will be available very shortly, so just check back to the web for that. I can't leave here without saying a big thank you to lots and lots of people. If you have ever planned an event of any size, you know that it takes a village to raise an event, and it truly took a village to raise this one. So first, I want to thank all of you here in the room and our very large webcast audience for joining us today and really being part of this very thoughtful discussion. We know you have lots of demands on your time, and we're deeply appreciative that you chose to spend your Tuesday with us. And we hope we made it worth your while. I also want to thank our fantastic co-sponsors, Habitat for Humanity International and Enterprise Community Partners, for their partnership not only on this event, but also their great leadership on this set of issues on a daily basis. Another shout out to the White House Domestic Policy Council. I don't know if Luke Tate is still here, but just want to thank him. He was another partner of ours throughout this process and helped us in securing our special guest. So a big thanks to him as well. And last but certainly not least, all of the HUD staff who were engaged in this effort. You did not see most of them today, but trust me, they were working very hard to make this a really fantastic event. So PD&R, a special shout out to you, but really to all of the HUD staff who were involved in every aspect of this event. We could not have done it without you. So thank you so much, and this concludes our program.